Greetings and salutations everyone joining this video for today. Today is Saturday, so good weekend to all of you. We have waited long enough. We have paused our review, our first look of Mythic Plus for a few days into this week. As I said, it was worth going over the raid very quickly because, you know, there was unlikely to be much to see in Mythic raiding this week. We would have gotten, you know, more heroic logs being relevant for this week, but for Mythic Plus players would have dove in much more willingly because of the item level unlock this week. So we waited a few days. Now on Saturday we can start going over how this first, this first 10 days or so of Mythic Plus have been going for all of the specs compared to the end of the last patch, because by the end of the last patch, of course, we have gotten all the way up to keys in the plus 30-ish level in 9.1, 9.1.5, Season 2. Currently, we are about 10 keys lower, so 20 to 22 level. That's the downscaling we have gotten now. Of course, many players are missing from 15 to 20 item levels yet. They are also missing double legendaries. Most of them are still missing tier pieces, so there is lots of power to go. Still for players, so the keys right now are still on a lower end compared to last season, but we have gotten enough logs, enough numbers at the moment in the hundreds of thousands for Mythic Plus, so we can start looking at the differences between this season and the season that just ended. So, of course, we are starting with the participation. We are starting with the difference between specs from one patch to the next, starting with healers this time around. Last season ended with I would say a domination of Holy Paladin and Restoration Shaman. They were split. The way this grew was that in Season 1 it was Holy Paladin that was generally the healer of choice in the higher keys, whereas Resto Shaman was the more popular one overall. And then into Season 2, with the addition of Covenant Legendaries, Resto Shamans started going Kyrian. They started using the Raging Vesper Vortex Legendary. This gave them tons of DPS. So by the end of Season 2, Resto Shaman also became relevant in the highest of keys. So what is changing at the start of this patch? Is this type of popularity, domination being broken by some other spec? Well, you know, when we look at all of the keys, so no real high keys yet, we can see that Restoration Shaman has grown compared to last patch, if it was possible. It was already the most popular, now it is the most popular by 20% more compared to the last patch. The main change, more or less, is the drop of representation of Holy Paladin in favor mostly of Holy Priest. So Holy Paladin drops down and Holy Priest is now... Holy Priest already was the better choice of the two in Mythic Plus compared to Discipline Priest, but now it is legitimately a contender for the top 3 spots. It is very unlikely that it is going to contest in any way Restoration Shaman, but maybe it can put its sight on Resto Druid, which is still more or less as popular as last season. Resto Druid remains a very popular healer overall, even when it's not really been the meta choice of a healer for the entirety of the expansion, whether it is Raid or Mythic Plus. Resto Druid has not been really in a shining position, but it remains very popular. So the main change we can see at the start of this season for the moment is Holy Priest being better than before and Holy Paladin being less represented than before. Now, does anything change in a little bit more competitive keys? So, for the purpose of staying more or less even in the range, we are looking at the plus 20 keys of Season 2 and the plus 15 keys of this season because of the scaling that happened between one season and the next. The main change is that while Resto Shaman remains almost just as popular in the higher keys, there is an even bigger drop of Holy Paladin compared to last season. As you can see here, from 26% to 16.5%. As a result, of course, Holy Priest is going to get the same treatment. They go from 11.3 to 17.9, which is also roughly a 70% gain compared to before. So Holy Priest is gaining and Holy Paladin is not. That seems to be the general take of the start of this patch. The other changes are a little bit more minor. There is, as a result, of course, this was obvious, a drop of Discipline Priest, given the rise of Holy Priest. Sure, some of these are going to be new Holy Priest players, new players moving to Priest, but a whole bunch of others are old Discipline Priests moving to Holy. The only other slight change is Restoration Druid becoming slightly more popular, a 30% or so gain compared to last season at the moment. These are the main changes we have gotten in this first few days, and couple of resets of Mythic Plus with different affixes between Tyrannical and Fortified. Generally, Resto Shaman has remained the same, Mistweaver Monk has remained more or less the same as the least played healer, and then the main change of the patch is the swap between Holy Paladin and Holy Priest at the moment. So moving over to the next of the roles, we have tanks. Now, last season we ended quite on a quite even note, because if you look at this, on the whole keys of season 2, it seems quite balanced, right? Because we started with Guardian Druid being very strong. From season 1 into season 2, Guardian Druid gained more and more popularity, while Vengeance was losing it a little bit more. But at the same time, as we have always repeated, Protection Paladin remained a very, very popular tank choice, just like Restoration Druid. You know, while at the same time, neither of these two picks were the most used at the highest of keys or the most used in red encounters, they remained some very popular choices. So, as we move into the first few days of season 3, the main change is that, well, I guess it's not that surprising, Protection Paladin gains even more representation. This is a 40-ish% gain compared to last season. Many of the other specs are not changing too much, like Blood Death Knight and like Brewmaster Monk. Even Guardian Druid is not changing too much. The only slight changes worth mentioning, besides the rise of Protection Paladin, are the slight 20-ish% loss of Vengeance Demon Hunter, which continues to slowly, quietly lose more and more representation compared to its golden days of season 1, and even more so the drop of Protection Warriors, which are dropping by basically 50% representation between the last patch and this one. It looks like many of the believers of Prot Warrior, the one that still put hope in a sudden 180 turn of Prot into this patch, have given up any hope of Prot being, I would say, viable, Prot being good in this patch, in this tier. So that looks to be the thing in all keys. What about the higher keys? So for season 2, the key is higher than 20, and for this season, season 3, the key is higher than 15. The main change between the keys at higher level is basically a switcheroo. In a similar way, actually, yeah, we do have some similarities between Holy Priest and Holy Paladin. This is instead Protection Paladin and Guardian Druid, because by the end of last season, Guardian Druid was still the overall most used tank in the higher keys, whereas this season there has been a reversal with Prot Paladin. Now it's Prot Paladin the most used tank, followed still by Guardian Druid. The other 3 specs in the middle are still very competitive with each other: Vengeance, Brewmaster, and Blood Death Knight. And then on the side, as we said before, there is a spec in its own tier, which is Protection Warrior. It's gonna be, of course, interesting to see as we get the double legendary combinations and the tier sets, how much is this going to change, if it is going to change at all in terms of priority of tanks in Mythic Plus. Now, after being done with the tanks, we can start looking at the juicy parts of the video as usual, because we are looking at the DPS now. Let's start with the melee DPS first. So this was the situation by the end of last season. We saw that we had an overall rise of Fury Warrior. Previously it was Arms being at the top, and then Fury slowly but surely overtook Arms. We also had Subtlety slowly gaining representation in Mythic Plus, a domain which used to be controlled by Outlaw, but this expansion towards season 2 onwards started being more and more centered around Subtlety. Most of the other picks were expected, right? We had Feral Druid and Survival Hunter and Frost DK as the least played specs. We still had Havoc Demon Hunter being very played, so not too many surprises in the end of last season. Turning into this season, however, in the first few days on all keys for melee DPS, it is, I would say, the most unchanged of all of the roles. because as you can see, you know, yes, the changes are a little bit more extreme, because Fury, that was more popular in Season 2, now it's even more popular. Subtlety, which managed to overtake Outlaw in Season 2, now it's even more popular. And the least played specs like Feral, like Survival, like Frost Decay are still the least played specs, but there are some slight changes, right? It's worth mentioning that, for example, Enhancement nearly doubled its representation. It's worth mentioning that Survival, while still not being very played, nearly doubled its representation from the end of Season 2. Many other specs have remained more or less the same. Red Paladin has dropped a little bit. You do have Windwalker Monk and Havoc Demon Hunter still being popular, very popular. So while we do have quite a lot of changes, they are not that drastic in the sense that the status quo is still the same between one patch to the next. By the end of Season 2, we had Fury, we had Havoc, we had Windwalker, we had Subtlety, and then in the start of this patch, we have Fury, we have Havoc, we had Windwalker, and we have Subtlety. Basically, the main changes in terms of priority seems to be perhaps Enhancement Shaman gaining a little bit more value in the start of this patch at the very least. Perhaps it is mostly due to the raiding part of Enhancement and not as much of the Mythic Plus part of Enhancement. So, what about when we start actually looking into the higher keys? What changes compared to the overall keys for the melee DPS? The main change is that by the end of last season, at the higher keys, even if Fury was overtaking Arms in terms of overall popularity, Arms was still the choice to go for in higher keys. And now, not really. Now there is a massive chasm, a massive gap between Fury and Arms in Mythic Plus. Most of the other picks remain the same. Subtlety gains an even larger gap to the other two rogue specs compared to last season. We do still see Havoc being very popular, pretty much unchanged. You know, not many people seem to have moved away from Havoc between last patch and this patch. We do have, however, another significant gap because Windwalker has dropped almost 50% popularity representation compared to the end of last patch. Well, you know, if we just see that Survival is gaining more players, that Enhancement is gaining more players, these melee players have to come from somewhere, right? It looks like perhaps that's where they're coming from Windwalker, which is being represented less compared to last season. So this is the current situation for Mythic Plus as far as melee DPS go. Once again, worth reminding, still no double legendary, still very few 4-piece set bonuses for players, and still not that many 2-piece set bonuses for players. So this is the current situation, more or less without the borrowed powers of 9.2. Lastly, the last of the roles is going to be the ranged DPS. So, the ranged DPS are going to have some slight changes here and there, but none of them are going to be too drastic, because by the end of last season into this season, the status quo is mostly unchanged, because the Hunters, as usual, remain a very popular pick as a class, as a whole, together with Mages. So this is more or less unchanged. We do have a slightly more representation of Beast Mastery compared to last season. The main change, I would say, is that Elemental Shaman is not being as represented as before. That seems to be only the only thing worth noticing within these changes from one patch to the next. I wonder if things could change even more once we start looking at higher keys. So people start getting a little bit more picky. They start choosing a little bit more carefully the players that they invite, the specs that they invite in the higher keys. And what we see is, once again, roughly what we have seen in the last patch. Yes, range DPS is quite boring in this regard, because yes, there is a slight change between Marksmanship and Beast Mastery in higher keys. Now it's BM, a little bit higher than Marksmanship, but it's not too big of a change worth going over. Shadow Priest is nearly the same as before. One of the least played specs. Elemental continues the trend of being slightly less represented, whether it is all keys or slightly higher keys, it's still not as represented as Season 2. We still have Frost Mage being represented as the pick of choice for mages, and I guess the biggest of the swaps is in Warlock, because by the end of last season it was still understood that Affliction was the Mythic Plus spec, because Affliction has tons of AoE. Affliction has some pretty good pretty viable AoE burst damage. It was also what gave them some nice padding logs in the raid because of their AoE. And now it's kind of gone, because even though they can still do that, it's now Demonology being the most represented in Mythic Plus as well. Demonology has of course gotten quite a rise in raid encounters, so similar to Enhancement, perhaps that's why more Warlocks are getting into Mythic Plus as demo right now, similar to how Enhancements have been doing in the raid very well, so perhaps that's the reason why. Most of the other changes are not really too worth mentioning. You know, Balance Druid is still mostly the same. It's popular, but not the most popular. That's been more or less the situation they have been in. This is the state right now for range DPS in this first 10, 11 or so days of Mythic Plus at the start of this Season 3. Now, as for the tiny little details worth pointing out, despite the fact that Beast Mastery and Frost Mage are the most represented of these specs, even at the higher keys, once we start looking at the actual top keys, the top groups, we still see actually a dominance at the moment of Marksmanship and Fire Mage. Fire compared to Frost, and BM overtaken by Marksmanship. This is still very, very early though. We are literally looking at 212 logs for these high keys, so it might still change very quickly. But you know, Fire Mage and Marksmanship, what they have in common is that they do have a quite significantly higher burst damage than both Frost and Beast Mastery. Frost and Beast Mastery are more in common for having very consistent, very stable damage, whereas Marksmanship and Fire are more on the bursty side. That is worth mentioning. Another cool little tidbit worth mentioning could be the performance represented in this graph by the specs in Mythic Plus. This is essentially the aggregation of all of the keys being done and logged by the players compared to all of the other specs and what they have been doing. You can see that Fire Mage, for example, as we said, is getting quite higher than Frost Mage, mostly because it is still used in the higher level of keys. And the same discourse can be said for Marksmanship, which is much higher than Beast Mastery Hunt. Some of the other specs are a little bit more predictable in this performance graph, like Retribution Paladin, Protection Warrior, Destruction Warlock, Feral Druid, Assassination Rogue are all floating towards the bottom. And, you know, as a better way to represent the situation of tanks, we can look at this. I'm not going to go into it because it is quite saddeningly self-explanatory what the situation is for tanks at the moment. Now, closing the video about the current situation in Mythic Plus for all of these specs, I think it's actually quite, it's always quite nice, the start of the season, right? Because everyone doesn't know quite well enough which specs are the meta picks, which specs are OP, so you do see much more diversity in the options. Just look at this, for example. You see the plethora of picks between Brewmaster, Guardian, Prot Paladin, Blood DK, Vengeance, basically all the tanks except for Protection Warrior. Same goes for healers. We do see the choices of healers. It's just mostly Mistweaver that is lagging behind a little bit more. So we do have much more diversity. Of course, I didn't mention the DPS because the DPS would look like this. Basically, your picks are Marksmanship, Fire, Subtlety, and Windwalker at the moment when it comes to high keys. But if we go down a little bit more in key level, you know, 18s, 19s, still very high keys for the start of this week, we do have quite a little bit more of variety. So it's always nice at the start of a patch when this diversity is more open. It's more open to consideration of all of the specs. I'm sure that in a few weeks, the meta will settle and players will be told by other players who will learn basically which of the specs are the strong ones to go after when assembling a group. But for the time being, everyone seems to have its chance of participating in groups, especially because everyone is eager to get into Mythic Plus and get gear that can be worth upgrading between one patch to the next. So it is the coolest moment, really, to progress into Mythic Plus. I guess it's going to be extended. I guess this coolest moment is going to be extended a little bit more because as the weeks go by, you're going to be getting your 2-piece. So it's going to be cooler to go into Mythic Plus with your 2-piece working, and then you can get your 4-piece. It's going to be cooler to get into Mythic Plus with your full set available and working, and then you have the Double Legendary. So it's also going to be interesting to go into with that. So it looks like this period of some pretty nice, I guess, exciting moments because of the powers that keep being given to you over time, constantly changing your spec, your power. Amongst the bad things of this time-gated release of the Double Legendary and the a little bit hard, really, way of acquiring tier sets, if you want to see the glass half full, is that at the very least it will keep your character fresher for longer. It will give you more incentive to play your character for a little bit longer, simply because of the powers that you will be able to get, and they will be able to change the way you play, or the legendaries you want to use, the talents you want to use, etc, etc. This is, I guess, the bright side of time gating. Now, with this being said, we are done with the Mythic Plus recap as well. We will likely go and check it again next week, perhaps by the start of next week, to get the full recap of this fortified week of Mythic Plus. Affixes are pretty nice, honestly. Storming should be a non-issue. I'm sorry, melee DPS, just suck it up, but storming is not that big of a deal. Bursting is also not too terrible, honestly. It's fine. It's quite annoying, mostly for the healer, really, if you keep messing up the resets of the stacks, but the keys seem to be manageable this week. They're not that oppressive, so it's a pretty good week as well for clearing. Luckily, in the first couple of weeks we haven't gotten abominations like Necrotic. Yes, sure, actually it's gonna be interesting to see Necrotic in its even more nerfed version, to see just how oppressive it's going to be, but you know, the later it comes the better. I don't care if it's nerfed or not. So with this, we can close the video for this Saturday, this overview of Mythic Plus for this, I guess, first week and a half of the Mythic Plus season. Thank you guys, of course, for watching the video and for supporting the channel in any way you can. You can like on the video as well as commenting down below as the law of YouTube demands. You can also go even further beyond and subscribe to the channel. For this video, I have personally unlocked the subscription button to all of the players who have gotten into, at the very least, 4 Mythic Plus keys already for their double option of the Great Vault. Okay, no, I'm not too pushy. I'm not asking for 8 keys for the 3 options, but at least the 4 keys. The 4 keys for the 2 options will allow you to subscribe to the channel. That being said, we can take a leave now. Thank you again for watching. You can also, don't forget, follow me up on Twitter, which is going to be over... Let's do it properly for once. It can be over here. And then if you're feeling ill, you can decide to support me on Patreon over here, which is also going to give you access to my Discord server. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon. And in the meantime, I am somewhat sad for Prot Warrior every time I look at it, this expansion, but then I go back and I remember what they were doing in BFA, them and their fucking Thunderclap, and I don't feel that bad anymore.